world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
You worked closely with former President Trump. There's been a lot of discussion in America, in particular in recent days, a lot of blaming of the Biden administration. A lot of people have pointed out that we've seen the Russian troops massing on the border for a year now. It was actually last March that they started to amass. So a lot of people are pointing a finger at President Biden. Do you think that's fair?
Oh, that's why I've been using for the last 3 days the hashtag Biden's war on all my social media accounts. I mean, this is the utter tragedy of the situation, Douglas, that young Ukrainians are fighting for their liberty. Children and women are being shelled by the Russians in a war that was utterly not called for, that wasn't necessary. Vladimir Putin is a psychotic, murderous KGB thug who took the measure of Biden, who saw the absolutely catastrophic surrender of Afghanistan under his watch, saw that when he came into office, Douglas, think of this, the first day in office, President Biden canceled the XL Keystone pipeline of energy into the United States from Canada, killing 40,000 jobs for ideological reasons. At the same time, he lifted the sanctions on Vladimir Putin's Nord Stream pipeline into Europe. As a result, in the space of less than 10 months, Russia became the fourth largest importer of energy into the United States. Putin has us over a barrel. He sees weakness, he sees a feckless administration, he sees the disaster in Afghanistan, and he made his move. I've been asked many times over the last 3 days, what would you say to this administration? What advice would you give? And it's pointless. The cake has been baked. We need Donald Trump back in the White House. We need leadership. I was so heartened as a former British citizen who grew up under Margaret Thatcher's UK to see not only Boris Johnson, but to see Keir Starmer together give that speech in Parliament where they say, we stand by the Ukrainians. We support every effort for them to liberate themselves. That's real leadership. And it is very sad that we have no such leadership of that ilk in the White House today.
Realistically, what do you think your former boss would have done? There have been reports this week, and perhaps you can confirm them or otherwise, of conversations that former President Trump, was said to have had with President Putin about exactly this. One report that's been doing the rounds this week was that President Trump told Putin that if he was ever to invade Ukraine during the Trump presidency, Trump, would attack Moscow. First of all, is that the case? Do you believe that?
Let me give you an answer, Douglas, that given your sagacity, you will understand what it means. I can neither confirm or deny the reports of that conversation having happened.
Yeah, we all know what that means. Okay, but tell me, I mean, realistically, do you think it was because, do you think the reason why Putin didn't take anything for the 4 years of the Trump presidency was a sort of fear of what Donald Trump might do? It seemed to have acted as a deterrent for other people.
Utterly. So let me just illustrate for your fabulous listeners. You know, when we came into the administration, we unleashed the American energy sector, which is the only thing that really makes Putin hurt when you're not dependent upon him. In less than 3 years, we became a net exporter of energy. And the first time in the history of the American Republic, we exported more energy than we imported to the country. On top of that, we took NATO seriously. We said to everybody, no more freeloaders, pull your weight, pay your fair share, including Germany. And then how about this? After 4 years of Russian collusion, he's Putin's puppet, President Trump is the first president in the history of the United States to order the targeting of more than 200 Russian troops in Syria. Not even Ronald Reagan greenlit the targeting and killing of hundreds of Russians that were destabilizing another region of the world. That was President Trump. Putin was afraid of him. Little Kim in North Korea was afraid. The mullahs, China, were all afraid of President Trump because he's not an interventionist. Let me be very clear. I wasn't an interventionist, nor is President Trump. We didn't invade other countries, but we sent a very clear message. If you threaten our civilization, we will come down on you like the hammers of hell. Remember that state dinner at Mar-a-Lago, where literally over chocolate cake, President Trump leans over and whispers to Xi Jinping, I just want to tell you, I just dropped 52 cruise missiles on Bashar al-Assad's regime because they were about to use chemical weapons for a second time against innocent civilians, including women and children. That message wasn't just for Xi Jinping. It was for Putin. It was for all dictators. That's why the catastrophe we witnessed today, Douglas, would not have happened if my former boss was still the commander-in-chief.
Well, let's come to another issue, which is the whole issue of NATO. When your former boss was in the White House, he was very often criticized by people as being anti-NATO, or in some way undermining the NATO alliance. Of course, what President Trump seemed to be doing was what every U.S. president in recent memory has tried to do, which is to make the Europeans pay for their own defense, to at least meet their commitments, their own spending commitments of at least 2% of GDP on defense. And of course, President Trump used perhaps particularly hard language, shall we say, against them, but it was exactly the same thing as every other American president has tried to persuade the Europeans to spend more. What do you think is the situation that NATO is now in? You have a wide knowledge of not just American politics, but also of European and particularly Eastern and Central European politics. What do you think the situation for NATO is today?
Well, I actually cut my teeth in the 1990s on NATO issues. I was a fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. So you know, the fact is, for 30 years, we've been trying to get NATO nations to get serious about this club. Imagine if you're a member of a club, Douglas, and 60% of, you know, the annual membership fee is 100 quid. Imagine if 60% of the members pay 50 quid a year. And then one of the members is supposed to pick up the slack of their not paying their dues. President Trump said, this is over. This ends now. If you're a friend, if you're a serious ally, act like it. I remember very clearly when Chancellor Angela Merkel came to DC for her first summit with the president, her first bilateral, and we were berated. We were lectured at about how serious the German commitment to collective defense was. Well, we pulled out the latest paperwork and said, Madam Chancellor, the president has just signed an incremental increase to the U.S. defense budget, just the increase for this year, that is larger than the whole defense budget of the federal state of Germany. You are not a serious NATO ally. We spoke harshly so that NATO would be strong. Now, as a child of those who escaped Hungary in 1956, witnessing again Russian tanks being attacked by Molotov cocktails because civilians are being raped and murdered, I say to NATO, it will be those who have lived under the boot of the Soviets, like the Hungarians, the Poles, and the Baltic states, who must show the rest of the alliance the seriousness of the situation and give an example of their leadership. I am very buoyed by what the British government has done with the deployment of troops to Estonia. Now is the time for serious gentlemen to do serious things.
And finally, briefly, do you think this is a wake-up call to NATO and that NATO can actually come into its own again? For 30 years now, since the end of the Cold War, people have said, what's the point of NATO? Is it clear what the point of NATO is now?
If this is not the wake-up call, then nothing is the wake-up call, and NATO will wither and die. NATO has been the most successful alliance of the military alliance of the modern age. This is the final test. Tanks are on the streets of a free nation today that has been invaded by an authoritarian regime. If NATO actually represents freedom and self-determination and the Western alliance of our civilization, they will be measured by how they respond to this war.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
I'm delighted that we're now going to be joined in the next section by an expert who's going to be talking with us about one of the things we've heard a lot about in recent days, which is sanctions. President Biden, Vice President Kamala Harris in particular, this week prominently said that they were bringing in new sanctions against Vladimir Putin, those directly associated with him, those connected to the regime. And this week, European countries have followed suit. Great Britain, of course, it was early in the sanctions game this week, with Boris Johnson announcing new sanctions in the House of Commons. Then, throughout the week, as the atrocities in Ukraine have grown, more and more European countries have joined in. And I think as of the moment of speaking now, every country in Europe is on board with sanctions against the Kremlin. But I'm delighted that we're about to be joined by a professor in financial technology and information systems at the University of Manchester. That is Markos Zachariadis. Markos, are you there with us?
I am. I hope you can hear me, and thanks for the invitation.
I can. Thank you so much for joining us. So we've heard an enormous amount this week about sanctions. What should we think about this? Is it an effective tool? Is it something that can stop Vladimir Putin? What's the effectiveness of this thing we hear so much about?
Well, I think one of the most popular sanctions people talk about, and I can see advocating on the web as well, is cutting off Russia from the network, which we call in financial services SWIFT, which stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. So this you have to imagine in the financial services world, there is an equivalent to the internet almost. That is an infrastructure that a lot of the banks and financial institutions globally, more than 10,000 of them, use to talk to one another and send payments to one another and trade in financial markets and so on and so forth. So a big part of the sanctions is essentially cutting off Russia from SWIFT and essentially kind of isolating from the rest of the global financial system.
And does that affect Russian civilians as well as the regime?
Supposedly, yeah. I mean, something similar had happened back in 2012 when Iran had the nuclear program and the rest of the world felt that they have to push them into not doing it. And cutting off Iran from SWIFT was quite effective in the end because it literally butchered their international trade. Similar to Iran, Russia relies a lot on international trade and exporting its gas and oil. And the gas and oil is a huge amount of the budget of Russia in terms of the finances and the tax they impose on international exports. So essentially cutting off Russia from SWIFT and not allowing them to make or receive payments internationally, I think that's definitely going to have an impact on the government. It's going to have an impact on the economy, international businesses. It's going to have an impact, in the end of the day, probably in the entire country and civilians as well. They're not going to be able to communicate financially with the rest of the world.
Now, Vladimir Putin must have known that this or something like it was coming. So there's clearly some kind of calibration that he has made, that he can hold out for a certain amount of time with sanctions. Do you think he has made that risk evaluation? And how long do you think they actually could hold out with things like SWIFT being barred?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Supposedly, I'm sure they must have thought the possibility of the West and the rest of the world pushing from cutting Russia off SWIFT, because if you remember, this was a possibility a few years ago when the incident with Crimea happened. So they must have been somehow prepared, or at least taking that into account in their own calculations for the current invasion to Ukraine. So there's no alternative way of communicating with the rest of the world financially, and the alternatives are very small and very localized. For example, China has a small kind of cross-country system that Russia is a member of, and of course Russia have their own, but these are very small compared to SWIFT. SWIFT is literally like the internet of finance. So cutting off SWIFT, all 400 or more Russian banks from the network will not allow the country to communicate and send and receive payments and trade in financial markets globally. So I think at the end of the day, it's just taking that into account when you're thinking about potential sanctions. Like if I was Putin, for example, I would definitely consider that. And of course, what are the benefits and advantages and disadvantages of actually having that happen? I mean, just a final thought on that. I think maybe they were expecting that the West will not really go on and do that, because obviously right now, We had issues lately in terms of oil and gas trade. And so perhaps Russia was thinking that this would be a major gamble for Europe, which relies heavily on supplies from gas from Russia. So, maybe that was a card they were willing to bet on.
And of course, you just mentioned China, but of course, China is one of the countries that is certainly not going to be involved in sanctions against Russia. A number of the largest trading partners of Russia are not engaging in sanctions. Kazakhstan, I think, China, various others. Does this have a material effect? Do you think that Russia can just fall back on a small number of its larger trading partners and ignore the rest of the world?
Possibly. I think it's just doing the math and realizing how much of the international exports you can rely on in countries that affiliate or your close allies versus countries that essentially are going to cut you off, like lots of the countries that are very impatient and want to put forward these sanctions towards Russia. So I think it's just whether the numbers add up and whether Russia will be willing and also able to continue as an economy, well-functioning economy, in the next few months, or however this episode lasts, if it's being cut off from the West versus other countries that they have closer ties with, like China, for example.
And as I come back to this thing of the time game, Tom Tugendhat said earlier it's far too early to make any predictions about this conflict, but clearly it's not going as well as Vladimir Putin might have hoped. He hasn't rolled into Kiev on day one. So this is going to start costing Russia, and it's going to start costing the regime. Vladimir Putin personally, is he vulnerable himself to these sanctions, or has he spent recent years making sure that his own extraordinary private looted wealth is far away from the reach of any such sanctions?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I'm able to answer that. I mean, I don't know the finances of Vladimir Putin, but he seems like a person that would definitely have taken that into account before making any bets. And I'm hoping that he also did similar calculations for the entire country, not just himself. But of course, as you have seen, other wealthy individuals like Russians of Russian origin across Europe and the UK will have, a big effect from these sanctions. So perhaps maybe it's just the few people and himself that he was thinking for when he was making all these decisions. Who knows? It's hard to say.
You'll remember that there was footage this week of President Putin in the Kremlin lecturing a bunch of oligarchs, and none of them, it has to be said, looked particularly happy with President Putin as he lectured them. Presumably these oligarchs are going to be increasingly unhappy as this goes on. The inability to move wealth around means that these extraordinarily wealthy men who have looted the natural resources, among other things, of Russia for the last 30 years are going to find their own movements restricted, apart from anything else, their financial movements, and in some cases their physical movements. That whole class must be at risk, not that one feels any pity for them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only thing I can say is even people like Abramovich, for example, who I'm hearing is not even in the list of sanctions against, wealthy kind of Russian individuals. He must be quite upset. And you can see the latest from Chelsea being up for sale, for example, or moving on to a different kind of ownership structure. I'm sure this entire situation will have upsetting a lot of people, not just in Russia, but also internationally. Imagine all these businesses, even in Europe, exporting a lot of goods and services to Russia. All these businesses in the UK and across Europe will suffer equally. It's not just Russia. And that's why, cutting off Russia from SWIFT has been, up for debate the last, 48 hours or so. People kind of really trying to second guess what would be the advantages but also disadvantages in this situation. It's a hard calculation to do. It's not straightforward.
One last question before we have to let you go. Of course, this war, these financial sanctions, and much more couldn't come at a worse time for the global economy. We've all been just bouncing back from the disaster of the last 2 years of the Corona era and the financial slump. Do sanctions against Russia impact us in the West, in countries like Britain, and if so, how much and to what extent?
Yeah, I think, and that's a good final question, I guess, to sum things up. I think, like any war in any part of the world, definitely has a major effect, not just in the economy, but, real people in different countries. I think the same is going to happen here. If, for example, all these sanctions push forward against Russia, it's not going to be only Russia that suffers. It's going to be a lot of other businesses across the EU. We're definitely going to see a hike potentially in gas prices, for example. I mean, thinking that Europe consumes more than 30% or 40% of its gas, from Russia, we're definitely going to see prices hiking further up, which is not great news for a global economy that is just coming out of a major financial crisis because of COVID. So it's not going to be easy, I have to say that.
The world headquarters of Common Sense.
Talk Radio.
We're very glad to be able to welcome to join us on the programme this evening Sir Gerald Howarth, the former Conservative Defence Minister and former chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the Ukraine. He's got a long-standing interest in the subject, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Sir Gerald to join us this evening. Good evening.
Well, good evening, Douglas, and a very great honour to be on your programme, if I may say. I'm a great admirer of yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's always a good way to start. Tell me, Sir Gerald, a lot of people have been mugging up on Ukraine in recent days, and you're not one of those people. You've had a very long interest in the subject. What's your own estimation of what we're seeing at the moment? Did you see it coming? Is it something that you're surprised by?
I'm not in the least surprised. Unfortunately, I think this was inevitable because of the nature of the Russian president, as we now all understand in words of one syllable, as he's made clear in his broadcasts this week. Putin really resents the breakup of the Soviet Union, resents the lack of influence that Russia has. It is a weak country in so many respects. Ironically, when I went to work for the Sukhoi Design Bureau in Moscow, who design their combat aircraft, I went to see them. They were very keen to tie up with the United Kingdom in the post-fall of the Berlin Wall episode, and they took me out late at night to a dacha about an hour's drive out of Moscow. It was December, and I drove with a police escort across Red Square with the snow falling. It was very romantic. And I got out to this dacha, and these guys to this day, I don't know who they were. I'd only just been left Parliament. I lost my seat in 1992. This was in December 1992. And the point they made to me was that they were very proud of Russia, and they didn't want to see the country raped of its natural resources. That is precisely what Putin has done. He's made no effort to modernize the Russian economy. They rely wholly on their natural resources, as we can see Germany completely enthralled to Moscow because of its reliance on Russian gas. So I've seen this coming. At the time of Crimea, I stood up in the House of Commons before the Russians entered Crimea. I said to the then Foreign Secretary, William Hague, what assurances have you had from Lavrov, the then foreign minister today, a disgusting figure, and that they would not resort to military means to win their way in Crimea? An answer from William Hague, I'm afraid, came there none. We have allowed him with impunity to attack Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014. He has annexed other people's property twice, and then he's done it a third time now, despite all the warnings and despite the fact Britain has a special locus, because as I repeatedly said, and forgive me for repeating it on the talk radio, but in 1994, John Major, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin were signatories to the Budapest Memorandum, under which the borders of Ukraine, its sovereignty and independence, were to be respected. It wasn't an Article 5, NATO Article 5 thing. Be respected. In return, they're giving up their nuclear arsenal. We've done nothing. We've allowed this to happen, I'm afraid. And the fall of Kabul, the retreat from Kabul, showed the United States was weak. And we have a weak president of the United States today. This is very serious, Douglas, for the whole future of Western influence and Western values.
Why do you think that when President Putin has made his own ambitions clear for such a long time, so few people believed him? He's famously said that the saddest moment of the 20th century for him was the breakup of the USSR, which, considering the numbers of terrible things that happened in the 20th century, not least for Russia, was always a quite extraordinary thing to have said. And he spent recent decades constantly lamenting this, constantly clearly stating his views, such as even to the former American Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, that he said more than 15 years ago that he didn't think Ukraine was a country. Why do you think, given the number of times he's made his views clear, so few people in the West have sort of believed him?
Well, first and foremost, one has to recognize that Russia has, with only two very brief exceptions in its time, its history had been democratic. One was the early part of the last century, briefly, and the second was after the fall of the Berlin Wall, briefly under Gorbachev and then Boris Yeltsin. It's a dictatorship. You're absolutely right. He's made it crystal clear that he resented the breakup of the Soviet Union. He made it clear in his broadcast this week that he wanted to effectively see it recreated, and anybody got in his way, he would resort to nuclear weapons. It has been complete naivety on the part of Western leaders. Nobody believed that in the post-1945 world that anything like this could possibly happen. And there has grown up a complacency. Because, I'm over 70. I have spent my entire life enjoying the liberty and prosperity that the post-war settlement, that's post-Second World War settlement, has brought not just the United Kingdom, but the whole of Europe, and indeed the rest of the world, with, of course, outbreaks of violence in various places. But nevertheless, it has been a period of steady progress, and I'm afraid there has grown a complacency. And I do hope that today's young people will sit up and take stock that freedom does come with a price. The ability to go about your daily life unhindered, to trade with whom you want, to associate with whom you want, has been taken for granted. And this is a brutal wake-up call. This is a tyrant. This is a brutal tyrant. And I don't know about you, but watching these news reports of young people returning to Ukraine to say that they're going to take up the fight, to see elderly, respectable ladies learning how to use a Kalashnikov, I think they're heroic, and I do find it really very, very distressing that we, powerful force in NATO, we are standing idly by. We could see this coming. I have repeatedly said that there was a risk of this happening. I said we should send a maritime task force to stand off Mariupol, the second port of Ukraine, on the Sea of Azov, up by the Donbass region to the east of the country, and that we should stand off Odessa and protect that area. Because I could see what Putin wanted to do, which was to link up with Crimea. He's now, of course, going all out. I suspect he is now slightly deranged and sated with power, and as you said in your introduction, vanity. We've seen it coming. We've done nothing about it. And I think it is a serious indictment of Western leaders and our complacency and our naivety that we have allowed this to happen, and that a wonderful, growing democracy, not faultless, of course it wasn't, but a growing democracy, lovely people, that they should be standing on their own, such bravery, standing in front of the Russian tanks and determined to protect their capital city. I'm really quite humbled by their heroism.
I couldn't agree more, Sir Gerald. It's an extraordinary thing this week, seeing the footage of ordinary people in Ukraine doing extremely unordinary things that have become normal for them. Middle-aged women queuing up to get their gun and to defend their city and their country. Young men of all sorts of professions and none called up to fight the very organized Russian forces. And it really puts into context our own luck in a country like this one, in Great Britain, that we don't have to face this, and of course hope that we never do.
Absolutely. I think since we now cannot put boots on the ground, that is it's too late. And I do actually salute the British government for the behind-the-scenes work they've been doing in training Ukrainian forces. They're a much better force than they were 8 years ago. And the equipment, they're equipping them with anti-tank missiles. I'm going to explore, see what further can be done. I hope British people will contribute to a fund to help them. But I think the only way ultimately out of this is that the Russian people will wake up and see that their fellow Slavs are being brutally dismembered by their own leader. I was called earlier this week by Russian television program, NTV, for which I've done a few interviews. Secretary of State for Defense Ben Wallace said I shouldn't do it last summer when I did an interview for them. But I did it because I felt that there are people in Moscow who speak English and therefore would understand the argument that I was putting forward. Of course, I didn't pull any punches. And they rang me this week and asked me if I would do another interview. I thought about it. I consulted a great friend of mine, Admiral Chris Parry, who is a great strategic thinker. And Chris said, Joel, on no account do it. Last time you did it, they mistranslated what you said, and you only encouraged them. So I decided not to, but I sent a message to the girl that I'd been talking to on the phone, Anastasia, and I said, you should hang your head in shame at what your leader, what your dictator leader is doing in the name of the people of Russia. Yep. And we're seeing some signs of demonstration of anti-war sentiment emerging, anti-Putin sentiment emerging. These are the people of Ukraine. They're relatives of theirs. This is a familial war in some ways, and I think that the only hope is the people of Russia recognize this brutal, nasty, kleptomaniac president of theirs, who has poisoned our own people in Salisbury, who's locked up his opponent Navalny, that he is toppled from power and somebody reasonable is put in his place and this war is brought to an end.
Well, very well said, Sir Gerald Howarth. Raymond in Winchester texts to say, Sir Gerald Howarth is a very fine man indeed. I had reason to meet him occasionally when he was Shadow Defence Minister. A pleasure to meet him and a very approachable man. A great man. That's Raymond in Winchester. Thank you very much, Sir Gerald Howarth, for joining us tonight. We've got a couple of other texts in from listeners. One has texted in to say, I am an Iranian British citizen and very proud to be a part of a country who's been leading the Western world to play an active role in this conflict. I believe that the West should take this seriously, as it is not about one country, but about dictatorship against Western civilization. The West should stop normalization of trade with dictators. And before we go to the break, Leo on Twitter says, evening, Douglas. And then he says some nice things about me I'm not going to read out. He says, in your intelligent, informed opinion, well, I could give another one, but in your intelligent, informed opinion, what's the best outcome we can hope for as this conflict unfolds, both for Ukraine and for us in the West? I would say that it's, Leo, it's what I mentioned at the very beginning before we spoke to Tom Tugendhat, that although Vladimir Putin hoped that he and his forces would roll into the Ukraine and take it over in no time flat, I would hope that, in fact, they get bogged down there, that the Ukraine turns out to be the graveyard of the despotic reign of Vladimir Putin. Not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the people of Russia, who deserve so much better. You know, one of the most extraordinary things about the absolutely deranged speech that Putin gave from the Kremlin this week, justifying this illegal invasion of Ukraine, one of the many deranged aspects of it was that he talked about not just about the Ukraine as if it was a made-up country, didn't really exist. One of the most bizarre things was he attacked oligarchs. He said our country has been raided by oligarchs who've stolen our resources. Well, he would know what he's talking about, because as everyone who's seen Alexander Navalny's film Putin's Palace, and if you haven't, I honestly recommend you watch it on YouTube. It reveals the way in which Vladimir Putin himself has ransacked the wealth of his country. There is, and I'll just leave you with this image before we go to the break, there is a moment in that film where, amazingly, Navalny and his team managed to get footage from the palace that Putin has been being built for him inside Russia and on the Black Sea. And there is a vineyard there, and there is a guest house in the vineyard, and there's a guest bathroom in the guest house of the vineyard, and there is a golden lavatory brush in that guest bathroom. And that golden lavatory brush costs more than the average Russian earns in a year. And when that was revealed, gosh, did it hit home with the Russian people. But this is just one example of the way in which Vladimir Putin has ransacked his country for his own financial gain. When he talks about people looting countries, he should know, because he's the premier looter of the lot, one of the world's greatest looters.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
We're going to turn to an only slightly less, maybe a much less serious subject, but one that is very disturbing. And we've been talking about the world's leading dictator at the moment, Vladimir Putin. But I do want to come on to a little mini dictator, or at least a little mini would-be dictator, who is sitting tonight in Canada. That is Justin Trudeau. You know that the world is totally screwed when even Canada has become interesting. Canada, the country that launched 1,000 gags for its boringness, and particularly for the boringness of its politics, has recently become a very unboring place indeed. I wrote about this in this week's Spectator, which I obviously heartily recommend you go to. But this story out of Canada is worth our attention, and I'm just going to line up what that looks like. In recent months, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who became Prime Minister, as far as I can see, for a couple of reasons. One was that his daddy was Prime Minister before him, and the other is that he's got nice hair. Other than that, he didn't seem to have much qualification for the role, but he got voted in a couple of times anyway. And he in the period of COVID, he has been one of the strictest world leaders. As countries like ours was coming out of the corona era, Justin Trudeau decided to double down on it. In particular, he decided to double down on insisting on vaccines for all sorts of people in all sorts of jobs, including jobs that there can be no justification, in my view, for insisting on vaccine mandates for. That included truck drivers. Now, during the pandemic, truck drivers were among the people celebrated in Canada as in Britain for helping keeping crucial supplies coming in and out of the country. But then the princeling Trudeau decided that all truck drivers, who are among the most isolated professions of all, should all be vaccinated or they'd be out of a job. And the truckers started to rebel. And they said that they didn't want this mandate and this insistence on vaccines. So in recent months, in recent weeks, they started to drive to Ottawa and protest about the mandates. Justin Trudeau did what you would expect him to do. He decided that all of the truckers were actually racists and misogynists, and I think they were anti-trans as well, in little Justin's view. He used all of the biggest insults he could against them. He particularly talked about the fact that the truckers who he'd never met were all racists, and we will just have to pass over for a moment the fact that anyone who follows Canadian politics will know that Justin Trudeau spent most of his recent adolescence in blackface. So let's ignore for the moment the fact that Mr. Blackface in Ottawa claims that everyone he doesn't like is a racist. But anyway, he did that. He then insisted on cracking down on a totally legal protest, a peaceful protest by Canadian truckers. It was an extraordinary overreach by him, and it has been, in my view, too much ignored by the other democracies. If this had been happening in Zimbabwe or anywhere else in the Commonwealth, Canada would have been chucked out of the Commonwealth, or at least suspended. The suspension of normal rights in Canada continued. Justin Trudeau instituted an emergency act which was meant to only occur in wartime, that if Canada was being invaded by anyone stupid enough to invade Canada, that he would use the Emergency Act. But it didn't require wartime. It required a peaceful protest by peaceful truckers and their supporters for Justin Trudeau to, first of all, flee Ottawa. First of all, claiming, by the way, that he had first met someone who'd once danced with somebody who had COVID, so he had to isolate. That was his first excuse. And then he claimed that the truckers were a threat to his life, which also wasn't true. Anyhow, he instituted emergency legislation, basically abolished all human rights in Canada for a period, and most of the world didn't seem to care. Now, there's been a lot going on, but I certainly think that there should be some attention paid to this. I'm delighted tonight to be joined to discuss this and other matters by Stephen Woolfe, former Conservative and UKIP MEP, and he joins us here on Talk Radio tonight. Thank you so much for being with us, Stephen Woolfe.
Thank you very much for having me, Douglas. Appreciate it.
So do you agree with the flattering summary I've just given of the princeling in Ottawa?
Well, I'm glad you used the word princeling, because I've been using the phrase that Trudeau has fallen to the madness of King George syndrome, from Nebuchadnezzar to King George and many, many leaders in between. I hear you talking about the Putin having that at the moment. When they have too much power, when they have too much control, they start to exert that power and control over their people in a way that is anti-democratic. And in Canada, they may be a democracy where the majority are actually behind Trudeau, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily free. And that's been very, very clear. I've been following this story from the beginning. I've been reporting on it. I've put it on my own YouTube channel, The Woolfe Report, where I have shown many, many instances of the violence meted out on these truckers who have been entirely peaceful the whole way.
That's right. That is one of the most terrifying things about what Justin Trudeau has been doing, because a very large proportion of Canadians actually seem to believe their Prime Minister, who has said that the truckers are Nazis, was one of his claims. He even, as you know, but some listeners may not, he even said in the Canadian Parliament last week, I think the week before, last weekend it was, a Jewish Conservative MP,
yes,
a female Jewish Conservative MP, criticised him, and Justin Trudeau said, well, you on the Conservative side may be happy to stand alongside people with swastikas, but some of us are not.
This is one of the most disgraceful elements. It's been a build-up from Justin Trudeau. He began, first of all, with the way that he treated those who did not want to take the vaccine. And initially, he was calling them misogynists and racists. Then when the truckers came along, he linked them as to being Nazi sympathizers and white supremacists. When he attacked Melissa Landsman, who was the Conservative MP at that time, with that horrendous statement, for a Jewish woman to be accused of standing by swastikas, when there was instances of only one or two flags of that in the whole of this campaign of people, ordinary people on the streets of Canada, thousands upon them lining the bridges as the trucks went through. That caused a huge storm. And when you then watched an incredibly impressive Conservative MP, Dale Lloyd, ask the Prime Minister to apologise 3 times. And amongst those statements he made, he said, Prime Minister, my great uncle flew 30 sorties across the English Channel to fight the Nazis. My great uncle is buried at the bottom of the channel, and you're accusing Jewish MPs here as standing with Nazis, resign. And I think the third time, and this is really instructive, Douglas, the third failure to apologize, you then look behind Justin Trudeau in the films and you can see his hands start to shake. He begins to stutter, and there is no longer any clapping or support or nodding from those behind him. I think at that moment, he realized that he had gone beyond the pale of being a liberal progressive prime minister to that of a dictator, losing respect within his own group.
I'd love to see that footage. I've missed that, but there is nothing I would like to see more than Justin Trudeau shaking, I have to say, after his performance in recent days. He said, you mentioned there his sort of the position he's got himself into. One of the reasons for that would seem to be that if you say that all of your opponents are Nazis, then you can't listen to them, can you, Stephen? I mean, he could have said, I will sit down with the truckers and listen to their concerns, or, you know, maybe we can do something about these vaccine mandates. But once you say, as Justin Trudeau has for years against all his political enemies, but particularly in recent days, once you say all of my enemies are Nazis, there is no compromise, is there?
But this is the mantra that I think you have recognized over the past decade. The liberal progressive leaderships, whether it's from Justin Trudeau to Ahern down in New Zealand, seems to be a virus that's infecting their political minds, that when they lose the ability to have rational discussion, be able to debate with their opposites, even sit down and talk to those people that they disagree with, then they start reaching out for vile language, the most abusive comments they can do. We saw it through the Brexit campaign, where there were people who were called thick, stupid, and racist. You saw it in the Trumpers, where they were called the deplorables. And I believe that this movement, this moment where a vast number of people have been vaccinated in Canada, suddenly started coming out onto the streets very, very calmly, very peaceably. And those marches that you saw in Ottawa, you had bouncy castles for their children. There were hot tubs in the snow. People were bringing out food and burgers for them. When the police came to remove them, you could almost see Trudeau wanting to have his January 6th moment, which for listeners who don't remember this is what happened in Congress and the Senate in the United States. He wanted that. They actually started to move away peacefully, but they still sent in the horses. And I'm sure you saw that really horrendous scene of an old lady with her own wheelchair being pushed to the ground and a horse's hoof on her head. And then the Ottawa police put a tweet out saying a bicycle was thrown at her, at the horses, and that's why they moved in. And everybody then pointed out, since when has a mobility scooter been a bicycle?
I'm going to ask you to stay with us, Stephen. Join us, stay with us till after the break. I just add to that, one of the fascinating things about what happened in Ottawa was that people could see the police lying in real time, and they could see Justin Trudeau lying in real time. He claimed that what was happening outside was a Nazi rally. As you point out, it was an unusual Nazi rally, and having an awful lot of incredibly peaceful people, no Nazis, a lot of bouncy castles, and a lot of love expressed to the police until they started to trample the citizenry and then lie about the citizenry. But anyway, we're going to have to go to a short break, but Stephen Wolfe, please stay with us because we've got one other thing I want to discuss.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
One other story I wanted to touch on this week is that there's a report that Sweden's no lockdown policy, of course Sweden never went into the lockdown as most of us did, was right, and that countries that enforced the lockdowns had significantly worse outcomes reported by their governments. Does this surprise you?
Evidence, not just only from the times that we partially locked down here and then loosened up. When we locked down, things got worse. When we opened up, things got better. In the United States, really serious research that showed those states that locked down heavily, California, New York, really were the opposite in success to those states that were open, like DeSantos's Florida. So it's not just in our own country and out in Sweden. there is now growing evidence that the lockdown process failed.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Thank you very much, Stephen Wolfe. I'm just going to read out a few messages before the end of the hour. Commenting on what we were talking about Justin Trudeau in Canada, Barry on Twitter says, I think Nicola Sturgeon is another one who would probably impose similar restrictions to Canada and New Zealand if she could. A dictator is waiting. You will have to hear my views on Nicola Sturgeon on another occasion, and possibly with the bleep button on a lot. David says on text, looking on, I envy the Ukrainians, their patriotism and love of country. As a proud Englishman, I'm surrounded by friends who'd rather be known as Europeans. Why have we turned on ourselves? And Will on text says, great first show, Douglas. Hope you will be back. Well, we shall see. You never know your luck. It's been great to be with you. I've had a terrific time. Thank you for all of your messages. Thank you to all of my guests. And I would just round out by saying that this has been one of the most memorable and worrying weeks I can think of in my own lifetime. Vladimir Putin seems to have smashed apart the whole post-1945 world order. Nobody wants war with Russia, but nobody can see what he is doing in Ukraine and think he can just get away with it. I know that saying thoughts and prayers are with people is one of the great cliches, but I think everybody who values freedom will be thinking of the people of Ukraine tonight and will be cherishing our own freedoms in Britain a little bit more tonight than we did this time last week.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.